When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, I want to talk about a minor antagonist that's way better in the show than the book, in my opinion. And we always talk about the opposite. Oh, the books are better in pretty much everything in the show. But I want to kind of look at it from the opposite point of view. And Alliser Thorne in the book, in the show, very different character. Just in terms of, yes, the essence of the characters are the same. They have the same kind of origin. But in the show, we get a lot more of Alliser Thorne being maybe not as antagonistic, being a little bit more respectable, showing traits of being, a good guy. In the book, I don't want to preference, Alliser Thorne is very much a definitely flawed antagonist, villainous character for the Wall plotline, and especially Jon, but he shows those other characteristics as well. In the book, it's just not the same because we just don't see Alliser Thorne all that much. And even some of the brighter moments, the best moments of Alliser Thorne, are not in the book. The show added that, and for one, they actually made a lot more of an interesting character. Now, we in the book right now do not know the fate of Alliser Thorne. He was sent on a ranging by Jon Snow. This did not necessarily go well, but as of right now, the trajectory of where Alliser Thorne is in the book versus where the character ends up in the show, vastly different. So we're going to talk about both the book and the show with Alliser Thorne in this video. So let's start then with the book. In the book, Alliser Thorne kind of is this antagonistic character towards Jon Snow for a number of reasons. For you guys that maybe don't know or need a refresher, Alliser Thorne was sent to the Wall after the end of Robert's Rebellion. He stayed loyal to the Targaryens till the very end, and for his loyalty and for his service, he was sent to the Wall. I think a really horrible system in terms of, Alliser Thorne was just supporting his king, the person, ruling at that point in the Targaryen faction, and he was sent to the Wall for it. Kind of crazy, but that's just how war works and all of that kind of stuff. And you even think about if you're Alliser Thorne, how even worse it is because you see all these other people getting pardoned. People like Barristan Selmy doing the exact same things that Alliser Thorne did. Alliser Thorne, he stayed loyal to the Targaryens. He wasn't pardoned. He was sent to the Wall. So Alliser Thorne holds a lot of resentment, especially towards the higher lords, and especially towards, House Stark. Ned was one of the people that allowed the Targaryens to lose and for him to be sent to the Wall. So going into the main story in both the book and the show, Alliser Thorne has a hatred and a bitterness, not only because he was sent to the Wall, a terrible fate, going here and not able to have a family, and in terms of living with a lot of criminals, people that are not desired as being good people, more or less. Alliser Thorne, in one hand, is feeling kind of like how Jon is when he gets to the Wall, where he's better than everybody else, but at the same time, also hating the upper class and all of that as well. So Alliser Thorne right away has a very interesting, complex situation with his character when Jon enters the story. And so Jon enters the story as a bastard, which one, people don't like, and Alliser Thorne is no exception to that. He doesn't like bastards either. And then also you have him being, part of the Starks, growing up in a castle, and something that Alliser Thorne really hates. Now, if you do believe that Jon Snow is a Targaryen, it's even more interesting given that Alliser Thorne was sent to the Wall because of the Targaryens, because of them losing and his loyalty to them, and yet he hates Jon more than anyone. But either way, in the book, he serves as an antagonist all the way through until eventually Jeor Mormont has him sent away to go to King's Landing to present this other's hand. It doesn't really go anywhere, but they kind of sends him away to get him away from Jon because Jeor Mormont really likes Jon, all that kind of stuff. Alliser Thorne then goes to King's Landing. He gets made a fool of, more or less. He doesn't really understand what Tyrion's trying to do, even though Tyrion is making fun of him at court, also is giving him help, like giving him access to recruits and things of that nature. But either way, Alliser Thorne is not really seen with the Jon Snow plotline until the very end of book 3. He comes back after really the Battle of the Wall is already concluded. Jon has taken command, all that kind of stuff. Everything we see in the show, which I'll kind of document the differences here in a second, doesn't happen in the book. Jon Snow takes charge a decent amount into the Battle of the Wall. Alliser Thorne is not there. He shows up with Jaina Slynt. They basically give an ultimatum to Jon, and a pretty evil one at that. They make Jon go, you're going to go treat with Mance Rayder, but secretly you're going to assassinate him because they realize this is going to be a one-way street. Jon is either going to fulfill his mission and be killed, or he's not going to fulfill it, and guess what? He's either going to turn to the wildlings or he's going to die. There is no happy ending for Jon unless Stannis shows up. So again, very much we see a lot of the negative sides of Alliser Thorne in the book. Alliser Thorne is very much not a good guy. There's no really redeeming qualities of Alliser Thorne in the book that much, at least that we see of, because we see it all from Jon's point of view, instead of in the show, where the show, not only do we get additional scenes of Alliser Thorne and they change around where his character goes, we also have a bit more different of a point of view on him because it's not just straight from Jon's eyes. And so then in the book, we see Alliser Thorne, participating with backing Jaina Slynt to be the next Lord Commander. Again, very different in the show where Jaina Slynt is not the person running, it's actually Alliser Thorne. That doesn't happen in the book at all. So as we continue through the book, Jaina Slynt ends up losing, and what we see is Jon Snow takes charge. Now, we still see the same things where Jaina Slynt dies, Alliser Thorne is then sent to go on a ranging that likely could end in his death. And that's kind of where we leave the story. Alliser Thorne is not present for Jon's downfall whatsoever. He might have like cronies that would maybe already hate Jon, and that kind of led to some of those things. But very much in the book, a lot of the officers actually respected Jon until Jon starts making decisions that go against their beliefs, all that kind of stuff. That's what gets him killed in the book. The book and the show have very different interpretations of Jon's death, and it's a very crucial part of that season and also the book. And so the book has a more, I would say, nuanced, because you have people that started out by supporting Jon and eventually they turn on him. The show, it's very different because it seems like you have more of a faction that already was against Jon, because Jon barely wins in the show, being Lord Commander. And so it just feels like that faction takes over. That other faction that voted for Alliser Thorne, they more or less just start getting people to come to their side, and then they assassinate Jon. So that is really the story that happens in the book. The show is a completely different story. So for the first 2 seasons, it's kind of the same. Alliser Thorne, an antagonist in the beginning, with Alliser Thorne that I think makes him a very understandable character, a very understandable villain. You see Jon walking in, feeling like he's better than everyone else, and I think Alliser Thorne, to a degree, is going to feel like, this bastard's coming in and doing all this stuff and acting like he's better than everybody. He isn't. And also, Alliser Thorne is going to be very biased. A lot of what motivates Alliser Thorne and gets him into trouble is his own biases, the way he's been molded by his experiences, like so many of us are. And in the show, we get this scene very early on after Sam has arrived at the wall. Alliser Thorne is basically reaming into Sam and Jon about basically, this being a play to them having fun, all this stuff where Sam is being protected by Jon, when in the real world, you can't protect Sam. Like, yes, you want to protect your friend, all this stuff. And Alliser Thorne is definitely going to get Sam killed because he's not utilizing his strengths. But Alliser Thorne is right in terms of he's experienced going north of the wall, of being so desperate that he had to go to cannibalism just to survive. Alliser Thorne has not only been a part of rangings that have gone terribly wrong, having to survive in the middle of winter, he also was a part of the war effort during Robert's Rebellion. He's seen a lot of things. And so when you have these younger kids coming in that aren't taking things seriously, aren't taking, the wall seriously, it's going to, again, make a very understandable character in Alliser Thorne. And that's why I like him in the show. Even though I don't, love him as a person, all that stuff, he's very understandable. He's a great minor antagonist because it's so easy to understand what motivates him. So Alliser Thorne, you get, again, through the first 2 seasons, fairly similar to what we see in the books. As we get to season 3 and we get to season 4, that's when everything starts to change, because Alliser Thorne is not present really in the book until the very end of that story, the kind of A Storm of Swords, the very back end of it. In the show, very different. Alliser Thorne is already at Castle Black when Jon gets back. He's basically the person in charge while Jorah Mormont is gone, and he is basically, in command. And Alliser Thorne makes a couple of questionable decisions as we go through season 4, specifically as we build up to the battle for the wall. He doesn't, seal the gate. Jon says that that's what we should do. Thorne doesn't do those things. Thorne is somebody that looks at Jon quite critically, because Thorne, all he has at this point is his vows, his loyalty to the wall, and upholding that. And also, you got to remember, he's a ranger. He's experienced the wildlings. He knows what cruelty can be done. He's lost probably friends and brothers throughout the years at being at the wall. And so when you hear Jon, who kills Qhorin Halfhand, he's sleeping with a wildling, he was with Mance's party, scaled the wall, it just confirms everything that Thorne already thought, that Jon being this bastard, and bastards have this stigma of being untrustworthy, all of those kind of things that Catelyn repeats over and over again about Jon. especially when you think about Rob's will in the book, I should say anyway. Thorne looks at Jon even worse. And so anything that Jon says, he's just not going to trust. Even though Jon is completely right, we understand everything Jon's saying. Thorne isn't just going to abandon them being able to scout north of the wall, sealing up the gate and the tunnel. I think he underestimates them as a whole. And you really see that when we finally get to the Battle of the Wall. When we see Thorne, he's on top of the wall. We have a great scene. One of the best change scenes from the show, from the books, is when we see Alliser Thorne and we see the wildlings. They're starting to approach the wall. They reveal themselves. Mance has lit his fire, and the war's about to start. And Alliser Thorne tells Jon was right. They should have sealed the tunnel. He should have listened. But then they have a talk about leadership. And it's such a pivotal conversation, especially with where Jon is going to go in the future. And Alliser Thorne, in a lot of ways, is a character that's molded by a couple different characters within the books. And they kind of just shift them all into Thorne because in the show, we don't have as expansive as a cast as we do in the book. And so they combine a number of characters with Thorne in terms of, leadership, in terms of a couple different attributes. And this one is really key for Jon. And Thorne just explains you have all these people talking to you about what you should do. And being a leader is figuring out what the right decision is. And sometimes you're wrong, but you have to stick through it because that's being a leader. I love this decision because it very much humanizes Alliser Thorne. Even though Thorne knows he's wrong, he has to stick by it. And I love that. I love that moment because up to that moment of the show, Alliser Thorne had been very in line with the book, where he's an antagonist, very hard to understand the character in terms of his motivations and things like that. He doesn't show many humanizing qualities towards Jon. Even think about why Alliser Thorne lets Jon go north of the wall to take out the mutineers at Craster's Keep. It's really so Jon will die. It's the exact same idea of, for instance, Jon being sent to assassinate Mance in the book. And what we see during the Battle of the Wall, what's so great is, again, they do a little bit of replacing because Danelle Noy is not in the show at all. They give Alliser Thorne a lot of that, where he's the leader. He's the person that starts off the Battle of the Wall in charge and taking control. And it's great because we see Alliser Thorne giving a speech when he goes down below, when Ygritte and the Thenn factions attacking the wall, well, attacking Castle Black, I should say. We see Thorne be a leader. It's not something we've really seen from Alliser Thorne, showing how he really is. His whole character is rooted in loyalty and what he believes to be right with the wall, even though his actions don't necessarily always look that way because of his biases, because of the things that are just built into his character, like his hatred for Jon and not being able to see through some of the things Jon is saying to him and not listening. So Alliser Thorne leads the watch against the wildlings. And if it wasn't for his initial leadership, maybe Castle Black falls much quicker before Jon can even get down there to then take up the fight and then win the battle. And so then we do see Jon become a leader. Right after Alliser Thorne gives him this whole speech about leadership, Jon goes into this leadership role. And we see everything play out. And then we get to the next, stage of Alliser Thorne and his journey, which is, okay, we have the Lord Commander election. Who's going to be it? And in the show, very much simplified from the book. I think it's actually one of the worst adapted sections of Jon's storyline throughout the first early seasons, because what's so great in the book is you have Sam, who's basically being a politician, getting everybody to back Jon Snow instead of Jaina Slynt, as Jaina Slynt is slowly consuming all the votes. And the longer that the voting goes on, it's more likely Jaina is going to win. But in the show, they really dumb it down. They have it be Dennis Mallister, they have it be Alliser Thorne, and then Jon gets thrown in at the very end from Samwell. And it's really interesting because you can understand why so many people would back Alliser. And I actually think it's more interesting in the show in terms of why people would back, say, Janis or Alliser, because in the book it is Janis, because Alliser Thorne is somebody that was in control of the wall. Since Jeor Mormont's been gone, he's the one that led them during the battle for the wall, albeit Jon took over. And Alliser Thorne has a lot of sway, given his background, nobility, all that kind of stuff. He's been at the wall for years now. And it's great that when we get to that point, you understand Alliser Thorne so much better. And we know Jon is going to win, of course, and I'm glad he does and all that stuff. But then we see, as we get into season 5, where you have an interesting moment, because Alliser Thorne now expects his life to kind of be what Jon had thought it was going to be, a living hell under your enemy. We have this scene where it's really the lead up to where Jaina Slynt is going to get his head chopped off. And Jon is sitting here handing out appointments, and there's this really bad job. And Alliser Thorne thinks for a second he is going to get it. But instead, what Jon does is he names Alliser Thorne the first Ranger, which is really high praise. And you almost see for a second, and I think people have theorized this. I never interpreted it this way, but I think it's a very interesting interpretation. Alliser Thorne then has a kind of a respect for Jon. That even though Jon doesn't like Alliser Thorne, the two are enemies, even though they might have had a bit of a talking, during the battle for the wall, all that kind of stuff, that Jon is still willing to step up and do what's necessary. He's willing to be a leader and to set his personal vendettas, all that stuff aside. And so when then Jon turns to Janis and Janis then denies him all that stuff, and you see this little small confrontation between Jon's faction and Alliser Thorne's. Thorne then steps away. Now, people have speculated that this was because Alliser Thorne, well, one, saw that, okay, Jon is a good leader. Maybe I should just let this be. He has a newfound respect for Jon. I never took it that way. I always took it as Thorne understands his position. Thorne understands that right now Jon has all of the power. If Thorne was to not let Janis be taken, Thorne would be opening himself up to being beheaded as well. And I think Alliser Thorne's a fairly smart individual in the show. Either way, Janis is killed. And we don't see this whole idea where Alliser Thorne is sent on ranging in the show. What then happens is we see the wildling plot come up. And this is where you get to the big division point, where even though Jon was giving some respect to Alliser Thorne and maybe the two were having a better relationship, this is where it all breaks down because Alliser Thorne, remember, he's committed his life to the Watch and to his vows, and letting the wildlings come through after everything that just happened. People just died at Castle Black. Think about how many men Alliser Thorne, especially as a ranger, an experienced one at that, he's watched die. And so letting the wildlings through is that breach of, okay, Alliser Thorne, once Jon is made Lord Commander, maybe wasn't thinking about assassinating Jon or any of those things, but as soon as there's now, an excuse to do so, because, well, Jon and Alliser Thorne's, ideas is breaking his vows. It's the same idea as the show, except it's all put on Alliser Thorne. He's the whole person behind Jon's demise in season 5. I find that this is so interesting because Alliser Thorne then flips it. Alliser Thorne is now the person in charge of Castle Black once again. Jon leaves to go to Hardhome, and this is where it all starts. Alliser Thorne now becomes the person in charge. People already are going to be thinking, wait, we're letting the wildlings through the wall? It's going to get people turning against Jon, and then you also put your biggest enemy, somebody already in the show that had half the people at Castle Black wanting Alliser Thorne to be Lord Commander. Those people then are going to go to Alliser Thorne, and so everyone's then going to move away from Jon. We even see this we see this mainly through the character of Ollie in season 5. We don't get to see a lot of the other characters how they think about Jon as much as we do in the book. But so all that happens. Jon comes back. Alliser Thorne even has the respect to let Jon through the wall. But at this point, Alliser Thorne's mind has been made. And in a lot of ways, if Alliser Thorne at this point would have killed Jon, I honestly think it would have been a better move. If Alliser Thorne was already going to betray Jon, which maybe he didn't have this fully thought out yet, he probably should have done it here, because then the wildlings are still north of the wall. You don't got to deal with that faction. They can try to attack you, but again, it's going to be tough for them. But either way, Jon comes through the wall, and we see what happens relatively shortly after this moment. Jon is more or less killed by Alliser Thorne. Alliser Thorne leads the whole faction, and you can say, yeah, there's other people that are involved, Ollie, of course, but Alliser Thorne is the main person behind Jon's death. And they do dumb it down quite a lot. In the book, it's way better the way Jon Snow's death is done, and I don't think it's bad in the show at all. Again, I talked about because the show focuses much more on Alliser Thorne as the antagonist of that storyline, that it works well in the show as well, but I think the book it is better. But it sets a very interesting dynamic then, because as we go then into season 6, how do we end out Alliser Thorne's storyline? And I think it's done pretty well, because Alliser Thorne, even though Jon Snow has been killed, a lot of people would say, well, Alliser Thorne should not admit to this, any of that kind of stuff. But Alliser Thorne comes right out and says it. I'm the one that killed Jon Snow, along with a lot of the other officers here. This needed to be done because Jon was breaking his vow, all this kind of stuff, and taking the initiative, not letting people speculate and go behind Alliser Thorne's back, addressing it right away. And this seems to work. Let's keep this in mind. Jon only had, the couple men that Ed had, plus Davos. The Night's Watch was behind Alliser Thorne, so Alliser Thorne did something right. And we know that the wildlings attack. This is the downfall of Alliser Thorne. But then Alliser Thorne has, I think, one of the best death scenes in all of the entire show because of just his final lines. Him saying he would do it all over again, even if he knew the outcome. It's such a strong and powerful line because Alliser Thorne, this has been his life. His loyalty and what he believes to be right, defending the wall, his vows to the Night's Watch, and him and Jon just were on completely different spectrums of what that meant. In a lot of ways, Alliser Thorne's biases are the reason he couldn't see Jon's side of things. The others are a bigger threat than the wildlings. His biases are what get in the way and get him killed. It's a really fascinating story because when you think about him getting sent to the wall, the reason he gets sent to the wall is because of his loyalty and because of him sticking with the Targaryens. Here he dies in a lot of ways because he is loyal, and however flawed the thinking is, he's loyal to his vows against the wildlings. The wildlings are the enemy in Thorne's eyes. So I just wanted to talk about Alliser Thorne because I've been doing a lot of B-roll, as you'll probably see throughout this video, and it involves a lot of clipping, so I'm more or less very quickly, going back through the seasons and watching them all. And Alliser Thorne, I came away, just with a character that's so undervalued, I think, in the show, and I wanted to give him his flowers. And I've been liking making kind of some of these videos where we compare book versus show characters and or plot points. So thank you all for watching, and let me know what you guys think about Alliser Thorne in the show and in the books. Bye, guys.